So if you just hammer it, and then shift up to 2, I give it a little bit because it's an old transmission, you can then rev it up to almost 7,000 RPM. Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. Today we have my mom's 2014 Honda Pilot EXL 4-wheel drive. So yeah, it's another family vehicle because that's all I have access to at the moment. But I might as well walk you guys through what it's like to own, what it's like for me and my family to drive, and what its ownership and maintenance has been like over the past almost decade that we've owned this thing, because we bought it brand new in 2014 for MSRP, which was about $37,650 in 2014 if I'm correct. And it was supposed to replace our old family vehicle, which was a 2010 Mazda 5 minivan, and the thing was actually pretty sick in its own respect. So let's hop in and talk about the basics of this car. So hopping into the 2014 Honda Pilot, we also have these step rails which are quote-unquote aftermarket, but they look OEM plus. If we turn on the light here, we have our window controls, we have our mirror adjusters, and we have a 3-pod cluster, which you can probably see if I put on accessory. You have your 3-pod cluster and your infotainment, which is the same system as my twin's Honda Civic from a couple days ago. You also have a lot of physical controls, including dual zone climate and including a climate system in the back, which we'll get to in a second. But more about the car itself. It is the facelift of this second generation of Honda Pilot, nicknamed the YF4, and the facelift came in 2012, which mostly changed cosmetic stuff. The engine, if we pop the hood there, we should probably turn the car on too. And you have the old Honda beep because this was made in 2009, this generation. We have Honda's single overhead cam 3.5 liter V6 nicknamed the J35Z4. It makes about 250 horsepower, 253 pound-feet of torque, and gets roughly 17 miles per gallon city and 23 highway. But that is kind of inaccurate because personally I've gotten like at most 16 or 15 in the city. But highway can get pretty good because of how much torque you have and the long ratios of the 5-speed automatic. You can get roughly, I've heard, up to 30 miles per gallon highway if you turn off the VCM system, which is like active cylinders management or something like that. It'll like deactivate some cylinders to save fuel. But overall, this thing is also pretty good because just like the K20 in my twin Civic, this has VTEC, which activates around 5,500 RPM. And it is you don't really have much RPM to work with. You'll have you'll think that you have 500 RPM to work with because of the gauge cluster, but this thing actually revs out higher than you think, which I will show you once we get to our driving. Getting back and talking about the Honda Pilot a little more, this second generation was upsized a bit from the first generation, as it was supposed to compete with the likes of stuff like the Toyota Sequoia or Land Cruiser and the American counterparts such as like the Chevy Tahoe, which explains its boxy sort of look. I've literally called it a big cube sometimes because of how it looks compared to the other generations of Honda Pilots. But back on the interior and talking about the trims, you start with front wheel drive, and all these cars come with the same transmission, a powertrain, because it's essentially just a Honda Odyssey with a actual SUV body and 3 rows obviously. So with the EXL, you get these leather seats, which have actually held up pretty well over the past 10 years. You get stuff like climate control, but on the higher models, you get stuff like an entertainment system in the back, like, you know, your TVs and stuff like that, which most people have probably seen on the Odysseys, but not many people know about in the Pilots. And we should probably talk about rear seating, which, no surprise, being a quote-unquote mid-sized SUV, this thing will easily fit me at 5'11". I have plenty of leg room. We have your fan system here, which isn't on right now, and you also have your small lamps here. Visibility itself is pretty good going all around. You have your little blind spots here because of these thick, I think, C or D pillars, and getting into the back seat, which you do by pulling this or just laying it flat. And if we get in the back here, you can see that this back row is mainly for, you know, smaller children or people you don't like very much, because my knees are right against the front, and you can adjust these headrests, but all in all, this thing isn't gonna completely fit like 8 adults. Maybe like 5 adults and 3 kids. And then because this is an SUV, I guess we can check out the rear trunk space. It is power too, you can do it there. But if we put these seats down, you can see that there's actually a really good amount of space, as my mom has a little stuff back here, but this thing can fit plenty of luggage and stuff like that, as we've taken this to and from the airport and on many road trips a bunch of times. Oh yeah, and also this takes 87 fuel, so regular. So with all that history out of the way, I guess it's now time for us to get out on the road and see what it's like to drive this 2014 Honda Pilot. Right, out on the road with the 2014 Honda Pilot, if you get the all-wheel drive, you also get diff locks if you ever off-road this thing, which I have once or twice, and it works all right. Like, VTM4 is a not so known about system used by Honda because they mostly just use your simple front-wheel drive based all-wheel drive powertrains. Another thing, this thing is essentially, like I said, an Odyssey with a SUV body, which is not a bad thing because this thing is just as practical as that thing. I hauled a couple of my friends and a little bit of their luggage too a couple months back, and it was very comfy for all of us. Another thing that I've used this for a lot was driving to and from high school, because for a little bit my mom was on vacation, and which means that this car was free for me to use to get to and from high school. And now as we enter the highway, I can talk more about the driving dynamics of this Honda Pilot. And the first thing is, the steering is pretty light, but that's expected for a 3-row SUV. But this thing is especially light. There's a good inch or two of play in the thing, and I have no idea if that's because of the tires or the alignment or whatever. As well as the brakes. The brakes are something that is known to be a bit iffy about big Hondas, especially this like stuff that weighs like almost 5,000 pounds like this, because if you slam, not if you slam on the brakes, but if you're on the brakes for a decent amount of time, say if you're slowing down from going highway speeds, you will definitely start to feel the brakes shudder a bit, and that just means that they have really low thermal capacity, which is understandable, but at the same time it's something to look out for. However, one good thing that I can commend this Honda Pilot for is its acceleration, because once you get into VTEC, this thing will pull like a goddamn train, even if it only has 250 horsepower. And especially with this 5-speed, which has extremely long gears, and it'll get me up to highway speeds quite easily. However, a downside of this 5-speed is these super long ratios, because if you try to get up a hill, you will definitely have to get up in the rev range, which means you'll use more fuel. Like, I think I'm in probably 3rd gear right now, just trying to get up this hill, and it's holding 3,000 to 4,000 RPM. So I guess in that way, it's sort of like, I guess, an old Crown Victoria with its big torquey V8, but it's slush box 4-speed, if that makes any sense. Road noise, however, is not bad at all, especially for a car in this segment, which is not the most aerodynamic to say the least. Wind noise is a bit off, but that's probably because of one of the many repairs that this thing has had. Damn, that's C8. One of the many minor repairs that this thing has had, including one involving the door, which someone might have just forgot to put a bit of weather sealant, which means there's a bit more wind noise on the passenger side. But it's nothing too bad to be worrying about, because not all Honda Pilots will be through as much abuse as this has been, as I'll get to in a sec. Over the decade of my family owning this car, it's been through quite a lot, from small scratch repairs to dents to an entire, essentially, engine overhaul last year, which started with a front-end collision that needed the radiator to be replaced. And then when we were coming back from a vacation trip to Hawaii, we picked this car up from LAX and drove back to our home in Orange County. But on the 5 freeway, we realized the temperature started to skyrocket and a bunch of lights started Christmas treeing on the gauge cluster. And then it eventually got so bad that we started seeing smoke coming out the rear end, and the engine started to sound funny too. So we started to pull over and the car just started to lose power, until we eventually lost all power and this thing coasted onto an off-ramp somewhere in, I think, Long Beach. The engine was kaput for all we knew, and we thought we were screwed, but after a couple minutes of staying on the off-ramp for a bit, the engine apparently seemed to cool down and not seize up, and we were able to drive to a nearby service station, or I think it was just, we started to drive to a nearby neighborhood where we dropped this thing off and got an Uber home with all of our luggage. Turns out what was wrong with this thing was that when they did the repair for the radiator, someone forgot a hose clamp on one of the radiator hoses, which means eventually the hose fell loose and coolant started spilling out of this thing, eventually causing the car to have absolutely no cooling whatsoever. So after being in and out of shops for roughly 8 months, this thing finally got back on the road in around spring or summer of this year, and now there's been no problems with it. It's not that this engine has any problems. The J35 is a tried and true powertrain that's been in plenty of Honda products in the US, especially like the stuff like the Accord, although that is a different J35. But it's just that due to mechanic negligence, this thing has been through a little more than the average pilot should be through. suspension is very soft over bumps, which is also both a good and bad thing, because you'll soak up all the imperfections of the road, no problem. But if you come to a slight harsh bump, the thing will just waft around as you would in a 3-row SUV. As we get back on the highway, I can show you a trick that I've been able to do with this thing to make it accelerate a little faster. As you can see, I'm not in D, I'm in 1, which obviously locks it into first gear. So if you just hammer it, and then shift up to 2, I give it a little bit because it's an old transmission, you can rev it up to almost 7,000 RPM and get a little more out of your gears than you would normally have if you just had it in D. And just like that, you're back up to highway speeds. Now, it's obviously not as fun as being able to bang gears in a K20 swapped Honda Civic, and I say swapped because you know what I mean, but sure, it's not as fun as doing that in a manual, but it is still fun because you get to rev out the engine a little more than you would if you left it in an automatic. It's weird, there's different fuel cuts for this thing depending on what transmission mode you have it in. Normally, if you had it in drive and you just floor it and let it rev out to redline, it would shift around 61 or 100 RPM. And then if you have it in 1 or 2, it'll go all the way up to like 68 or something like that, which means you have more than enough VTEC range to work with. That being said, one of my main complaints about this Pilot is the transmission, the Slushbox 5-speed, which I can't really blame them for because this car is essentially from 2009. 2014 was one of the last model years of this thing because it was replaced by the 3rd gen Honda Pilot with the brand new 6 and 9 speed automatics in 2016. 2015 was the last model year for this generation. So to wrap this somewhat brief review of the 2014 Honda Pilot 4-wheel drive up, sorry that I don't really have much daylight to work with. I'll try to work on that in the future. But this thing has been my family hauler for the past decade, so I can't really hold it that much. Locked in. But yeah, this thing causes no trouble outside of the weird accidents or imperfections that it's had, and I think it's a really good SUV, especially if you're looking to buy used, because it's boxy and you have plenty of interior space. It is a bit big on dimensions and it's kind of hard to see over the hood, but that's stuff that you can get used to if you're a good driver. You also have these big ass truck-like mirrors if you need to look behind you, and fuel economy can be good on the highway if you just leave it if you let the automatic do its thing and stay in high gear. However, if you need to kick down though, it'll definitely give you power on tap, no problem. But overall, if you wanted my opinion, if you were to buy a Honda Pilot from the mid-2000s, I would go ahead and just find one from the 3rd generation anyway, because this car does show its age as it was getting to the end of its model year run. Everything feels like it's from 2009 Honda rather than something from 2014 or 15, where they had the 9th gen Civic, they had the 9th gen Accord. Everything started to feel much nicer, not to mention switchgear and powertrains and all that. So definitely maybe look for the earlier years of this generation because you're not missing out on much. It would be called the YF3 in that case. That being said, I hope you enjoyed this rather short and pretty fast-paced video. I'm sorry for that. I'll try to work on it in the future because again, I'm pretty new to this. But if you enjoyed, if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you guys in the next one. See ya. The fuck, a Subi broken down on the side of the road? That's unheard of.